Before we get started, we want to share that we are dedicating this webinar to the lives lost to domestic abuse, including economic abuse. So each statistic, each case that we're going to talk about today represents a person whose life mattered and whose loss and whose absence is profoundly felt by those who love them. Our commitment to this work is grounded in the belief that learning from these deaths must lead to systemic change so that fewer families have to endure such loss in the future. We also want to share a trigger warning and a content warning. So this session will include detailed accounts of deaths linked to domestic abuse, including economic abuse. We'll be talking about cases of homicide and suicide. We'll be sharing case studies throughout, which include details of victims' experiences and the deaths. So please do exercise self-care. And if you would like to access support regarding your own experiences of economic abuse, please check out the link which Sharon is going to share in the chat, which is a directory of support services. And for anyone who doesn't know Surviving Economic Abuse, or SEE, we are the only UK charity dedicated to raising awareness of economic abuse and transforming responses to it. We work to save lives and stop economic abuse forever. And our 3-year strategy will drive legal and policy reforms and systemic change in frontline financial and public services and increase public understanding so that more people can spot the signs of economic abuse and access support.
Okay, so from the slides you will see today's agenda. We are going to be with you until 2 o'clock today, and we will cover an introduction to who we are at Surviving Economic Abuse and what economic abuse actually is. We'll also look at findings from our latest research called Hidden Risks, Fatal Consequences. So Catherine will be presenting this section. And then later in the session, it will be over to me to look at an introduction to our brand new e-learning on economic abuse and domestic abuse related death reviews. So first of all, what actually is economic abuse? So today we'll be referring to economic abuse within the context of domestic abuse, and we'll largely be referring to intimate partner abuse, although obviously there are other relationship dynamics when it comes to domestic abuse, for example, parent-child abuse and sibling abuse, but our work focuses mainly on economic abuse as a form of violence against women and girls and intimate partner violence. So we know that economic abuse can happen to absolutely anyone, whether they be male, female, trans or non-binary, but we also acknowledge that women are disproportionately impacted by economic abuse, particularly Black, Asian and ethnic minority women and disabled women actually. So you'll see from the slide there that economic abuse is legally defined as any behaviour that has a substantial and adverse effect on a person's ability to acquire, use or maintain money or other property or obtain goods or services. So that's from the Domestic Abuse Act in England and Wales. So that was the first time this official legal definition was given. And next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. So here at SEE, we describe 3 broad ways in which economic abuse tends to operate. And you'll see descriptions of those tactics on the screen there. So restriction, exploitation and sabotage. And this conceptual framework was actually developed by our Surviving Economic Abuse founder, Dr. Nicholas Sharp Jeffs. So a few examples of what those tactics actually look like. So restriction happens when a perpetrator limits access to money, to work, or the daily essentials that we need to live actually. So for example, it could look like someone stopping their partner from working, it could look like someone taking their car keys or withholding their access to money. Exploitation could be when a partner is using their partner's resources for their own personal gain, for example, forcing them to pay bills, building up credit in their name, destroying their credit file, or living rent-free and refusing to contribute to any of the household costs. And sabotage is when they deliberately damage economic stability. So things like cancelling payments, hiding bills, destroying items, or running up debts that result in credit files being diminished, preventing independence and ultimately causing dependence on the perpetrator or abuser. It's really important to think about the context of domestic abuse as well, that is framing this behavior, because these behaviors rarely actually happen once. They build up gradually over time, and often they're small acts that form a sustained pattern of control. So an abuser could begin by doing something like, under the guise of caring, oh, just checking spending, managing the finances. It could look like starting to then demand receipts for everything, restricting access to online banking, and ultimately isolating the victim survivor from their own financial decisions. And even after separation, control continues and often escalates post separation, actually, for example, through things like joint accounts, shared debts, legal ties. Joint mortgage abuse is another huge one, and weaponizing the child maintenance service is a really common tactic of economic abuse as well. So this is within the context of domestic abuse, so often occurs alongside other forms of coercive control. It's not always about money, it's about power, control, and creating dependence on abusers. So economic abuse is domestic abuse, and it is actually a crime. So next slide, please, Catherine.
Thank you, Sharon. And just to share a little bit about the impact and the scale of economic abuse. So last year, we released research entitled Counting the Cost. And this research with Ipsos UK found that 1 in 7 women in the UK have experienced economic abuse from a current or an ex-partner in the last 12 months. So that's equivalent to 4.1 million women in the last 12 months alone. The research also captured that ethnically minoritized women, disabled women, young women, and women with children were disproportionately affected by economic abuse. That 1 in 10 women had become homeless as a result of the perpetrator's economic abuse. Nearly 1 in 4 victim survivors said the economic abuse prevented them from leaving the abuser, and over a third had experienced mental health impacts as a result of the economic abuse. Over a quarter said that the perpetrator used physical force on them, or that the perpetrator had made threats to hurt or to kill them alongside the economic abuse. And now we know about the scale and impact of economic abuse, I just wanted to share a little bit about what domestic homicide reviews are for anyone who's maybe not as familiar with them. So they are a statutory review process where someone over the age of 16 has died or appears to have died as a result of violence, abuse, or neglect from someone that they were related to, in a relationship with, or lived with. And so the aim of DHRs is to identify lessons which can be learned from the death. They're conducted on a local level with responsibility held by the relevant community safety partnership. So an independent chair is appointed and a local panel made up of services who had contact with those involved in the review or who bring relevant expertise. Review should also involve the testimony of those who knew the victim or perpetrator, including family and friends. So the chair compiles a report, including recommendations and lessons to be learned, which is then submitted to the Home Office and the Home Office Quality Assurance Board for review and to approve publication of the review. We're aware that changes are coming around the name of domestic homicide reviews and also the awaiting updated statutory guidance from the Home Office on conducting these reviews. But to share further research that I'm going to talk about in a second, we used the term DHRs to align with the terminology that was in use during the research period. So that brings me on to the next part of the webinar, which is to share findings from our research on economic abuse in domestic homicide reviews in England and Wales. So I represented surviving economic abuse on the Home Office's Quality Assurance Panel for DHRs from early 2019 to mid 2025, so last summer. And we wanted to conduct this research to bring together and reflect on our learning on economic abuse in DHRs in England and Wales from this time period. So from our time on the Quality Assurance Panel, we had a database of 454 DHRs, which we used to conduct quantitative analysis on. So this included all DHRs, which came to us on the QA panel. So it included all types of deaths, all types of relationships. Deaths occurred between 2012 and 2024. In addition to that, we also qualitatively analysed 15 reviews where we knew the victim had experienced economic abuse from an intimate partner prior to their death. So these 15 cases were all in the public domain, and throughout the findings, I'm going to share some details of these cases. We've used the names that were used in the DHR report, and we've also included quotes from the reviews so that we can remember, like I said before, that these are real people that we've lost. They aren't just cases and numbers. So it's a bit of an overview of the full sample of 454 reviews. The majority of cases involved the death of a victim who had experienced partner abuse. Most reviews were into homicides, but around a fifth involved death by suicide. And of these 454 reviews, over half involved the victim experiencing economic abuse from their intimate partner. This included cases both where it had been identified in the DHR report itself, or where I had identified it when reading the review as part of the quality assurance process. So based on when the first and last deaths occurred, this is equivalent to a victim who had experienced economic abuse from their intimate partner dying every 19 days. And moving on to look at the demographic information for those 231 cases where a victim had experienced economic abuse from an intimate partner prior to the death. In line with what we know about domestic abuse and related deaths more broadly, most victims of economic abuse from a partner were female, and most of the perpetrators were male. The youngest victim was 18 at the time of the death, and the oldest was 91. But when we include those who were killed alongside the victim over the age of 16, the youngest victim was 4 years old. Where it was known, 84% of victims were white and 16 were from ethnically minoritized backgrounds. This includes 10% of victims who were Asian, 4% of victims who were Black, and 2% from multiple ethnic groups. We also found that a higher proportion of reviews where the victim had experienced economic abuse from an intimate partner involved suicide compared to all other cases, and this was found to be statistically significant. It's important to note as well here that the findings are where the demographic information was known and recorded. So other researchers using DHRs have found that this can be inconsistently recorded, and this is something we encountered as well. And in addition, we do have findings on perpetrators that are coming in a forthcoming book chapter. And in those 231 reviews where economic abuse from the intimate partner was identified, we used the descriptions of the behaviours of economic abuse to categorise them using the restrict, exploit and sabotage framework that Sharon discussed earlier. So economic exploitation was the most common form of abuse identified in 59% of cases, followed by economic sabotage in 52% and economic restriction in 49%. Obviously, victims could experience more than one type of category of behaviour. And it's important as well that these findings are limited by what behaviours were included and described in reviews. So we think it's really likely that some behaviours of economic abuse weren't included, which also likely means that our finding that 51% of cases involved economic abuse from a partner is probably an underestimate, because some of those behaviours just might not have been captured in DHRs. So I'm going to move on now to talk about what some of those behaviours look like, starting with economic restriction. So these behaviours from perpetrators involved controlling the victim's finances. For example, one perpetrator was described as taking full control over the victim's finances, including her salary and her savings. Victims had to account for purchases. For example, one victim had to justify buying tampons. And this control over their economic resources, their money they're spending, was often contrasted with the perpetrator spending freely. Restriction also involved the perpetrator restricting the victim's access to their own bank accounts, making the perpetrator making the victim financially dependent, which occurred in multiple reviews, restricting the victim's access to information. So, for example, one perpetrator redirected her post to his new address post-separation, and restricting access to resources, including having mobile phones and utilities cut off or taking really important identity documents. And so I want to share the case of Andrea with you. Andrea was a 43-year-old Black British woman. She and her two children, Jordan, aged 8, and Sammy, aged 4, were killed in December 2015 by Andrea's partner, who was also the children's father. The perpetrator restricted the family's access to resources, including strictly controlling the diet and taking away things that Andrea's family bought for her or for the children. He was financially dependent on Andrea, but the perpetrator demeaned her work as an actress and restricted her ability to work. Before her death, Andrea had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Following her diagnosis, she'd arranged with her mother that she and the children would move in with her and that her mother would look after the children following Andrea's death from the illness. This didn't happen, as the perpetrator killed Andrea, Jordan, and Sammy soon after her diagnosis. After their deaths, he also took money from Andrea's bank account and texted her family from her phone, leading to the belief that she was still alive. He was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and given a whole life sentence. In the review, Andrea was described as being loyal and loving to her family and friends. And I also wanted to share the case of Louise. Louise was a 32-year-old woman who died by suicide in March 2020. A female partner had Louise's benefits paid into her bank account. Louise would have to ask for anything she needed, and Louise's partner also messaged her friends to ask for money. If Louise confronted her partner, she would be physically abused. She also forced Louise to engage in sexual activity with men for money and would kick Louise out of their home. Before her death, Louise had been supported to have open her own independent bank account. She was reaching out to services about refuge spaces, but they were non-suitable. Louise's mum described her as the funniest, kindest girl. And moving on to economic exploitation in the reviews and how this presented. So this included coerced debt, this happened in multiple reviews, and there were debts such as rent arrears and council tax, as well as debts from the victim's family and friends. Perpetrators also exploited the victim's money and resources, such as by selling the victim's belongings or trying to convince the victim to cash in a pension, wanting to use child benefit money, for example, for a new car, or taking money from the victim and their children, including lump sums like inheritances or compensation payments. Multiple perpetrators also refused to contribute to joint costs, including those associated with raising children. And there were multiple reviews where the victim said that she felt she was financially responsible for the perpetrator, and then this was a barrier to her leaving the relationship. There was also sexual exploitation, as Louise experienced, and exploitation of life insurance policies, which I'm going to come on to in a second. But firstly, I want to share the case of Tara. Tara was a 29-year-old white British woman who died in October 2016. She had 3 children with her abusive partner, who severely assaulted her before her death, but the post-mortem concluded that this wasn't the cause of her death. Tara was 15 when she and the perpetrator met. He was 20 years old. Tara soon became pregnant. The relationship was on and off for a long time, and he didn't provide financial support for the children when they were separated. When Tara received an inheritance at the age of 18, this was spent entirely on the perpetrator. She had been studying to become a midwife during a period of separation, but stopped this when the relationship resumed. The perpetrator was known to assault her, including while she was pregnant and by putting his hands around her throat. She told police that she was frightened of him. The perpetrator was found guilty of grievous bodily harm. Tara's family told the review that before her death, her life was beginning again, and that she was getting great satisfaction from helping others, especially other mothers. And coming back to life insurance, I want to share the case of Jessica. Jessica was a 34-year-old British Asian woman who was killed by her husband in May 2018. They were undergoing private fertility treatment, but Jessica wasn't aware that her husband was taking medication to sabotage this. He isolated her from her family. He was physically and verbally abusive. Jessica's husband had also formed a relationship with a man in Australia. Had he not been convicted of murder, he would have received around £2 million in life insurance policies he held on Jessica. And it's thought that he intended to use this money to move to Australia to carry on the relationship. Jessica's family also told the review that they think he intended to use one of Jessica's fertilized embryos so that he and his new partner could raise a child together. He denied murder. He tried to frame it as a burglary gone wrong, but he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Jessica's family described her as a truly selfless soul. And moving on to how economic sabotage presented in reviews, this looked like the perpetrator damaging, destroying the victim's belongings, abuse around mortgages or house sales. For example, in several reviews, the sale of the family home appears to have been viewed by the perpetrator as a challenge to their control or signifying the victim's increase in independence and the steps around leaving the relationship. Sabotage also included the perpetrator preventing the victim from working or studying, including forcing the victim to quit a job, limiting her ability to work, harassing her whilst at work, being unreliable with childcare to prevent her working, or preventing the victim from attending the job centre. And perpetrators also sabotaged children's education. Sabotage included behaviours around child maintenance, including one perpetrator who killed the victim after she restarted her application for child maintenance. One perpetrator also caused the victim's bank account to be frozen by reporting her for fraud. And there was also the abuse of legal proceedings, as seen in the case of Rose. So Rose was a 33-year-old white British woman who had 2 children. She was murdered by her ex-partner in April 2022. During the relationship, Rose often had lent the perpetrator cash, which he then repaid by transferring it into her bank account. After the relationship ended, he made a civil court claim against Rose for the amount that he'd repaid into her account during their relationship, saying that these were loans that Rose hadn't repaid to him. In court, he falsified emails from Rose agreeing to pay him back. Rose disclosed domestic abuse during the civil process, but the court granted the order to the perpetrator. Their relationship resumed, and when it ended, he initiated enforcement action on the debt and used this process to abuse Rose, telling her he'd paid off, but then instructing further action. The DHR also talks about how he used this process to lure Rose to the location where he killed her. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 32 years. And Rose's family described her as someone who was always out and about and who loved walking and being outdoors. And thinking about economic sabotage as well, I also wanted to share the example of Trish, who was a 56-year-old white British woman who had an adult child. She was killed by her ex-partner in November 2017, and they'd separated several months before her death, with Trish remaining in the family home. Trish had ran a nail business from home, and after the relationship began, the perpetrator persuaded her to move to a remote area, which severely reduced her client base. He then stopped her from offering acrylic nails, which reduced it even further. When they moved, he didn't initially put Trish on the mortgage and later remortgaged the home to buy an expensive car. When they separated, Trish talked about being financially dependent on the perpetrator. She disclosed the abuse to a solicitor, who told her it would be unlawful for her to change the locks on the home. The perpetrator killed Trish following an argument over selling the house. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison. And Trish was described as an amazing woman who lit up the lives of those who knew her. And this range of behaviours demonstrates the wide range of ways that perpetrators can enact economic abuse. Unfortunately, in those 15 reviews we analysed in more detail, it was rare that the victim's experiences were recognised by agencies, including where the victim had disclosed experience in economic abuse. There were missed opportunities by a range of agencies to recognise the risks that victims were at or to respond to the economic abuse, including from the Child Maintenance Service, the police, social work, legal professionals and the MARAG process. For example, one victim told police that she was financially dependent on the perpetrator and scared that he might kill her. Whilst this was initially assessed as high risk, it was then downgraded to medium. In another case, the victim had disclosed to CMS that the perpetrator had threatened her unless she withdrew her application, but the call taker didn't offer her any information or support around domestic abuse. In some cases, agencies inadvertently facilitated the economic abuse. For example, the bank that froze the victim's bank account after the perpetrator reported her for fraud. Whilst they quickly resolved the issue, they didn't recognise it as economic abuse, instead classing it as a civil issue. There were, however, some examples of good practice. For example, like Louise, who was supported to open an independent bank account after services learned she didn't have one of these. And then looking at domestic homicide reviews themselves, less than half of the 231 reviews where economic abuse from an intimate partner was identified recognised the economic abuse in the report. This impacts the understanding of victims' experiences and also the resultant recommendations in a review. In the 15 reviews that we analysed in more depth, only 4 included explicit recommendations linked to economic abuse. These were on both the local and national level and included recommendations around training on economic abuse. Again, both locally and nationally, including for social workers, for CNS staff. There was also recommendations around awareness raising of economic abuse, again, both locally and nationally, including for civil courts. Recommendations on sharing learning on the forms and types of economic abuse that have been identified during the DHR. Recommendations on incorporating economic abuse into local strategies, and the need for economic abuse to be included in risk assessments, including recommendations to update tools like the DASH. There were also missed opportunities for learning around economic abuse because agencies didn't engage with the DHR process. For example, one DHR had tried numerous times to engage with a mortgage provider who they believed held key information, but this provider didn't respond. And these findings are difficult. They point to how much work we have to do to ensure that all victim survivors of economic abuse receive support. We also found that there's room for improvements in the recognition of economic abuse in DHRs. Without this, learning opportunities are being lost and more victim survivors are at risk. So we've got a number of recommendations from the research. This includes a need for economic abuse to be integrated in risk assessments and risk management. So we're calling for economic abuse to be included into the government's forthcoming guidance on best practice for risk management and multi-agency working, as outlined in the VOG strategy. We're also recommending that frontline police officers receive training on integrating economic abuse into assessment and management of risk, and for those involved in DHRs like CSPs, local panels and DHR chairs to access specialist training on economic abuse in DHRs. We think it's also vital that DHR panels can reflect and understand victims' experiences of economic abuse from an intersectional perspective, including for victims who are racially minoritized, who are disabled, and who are migrants. We're also asking the Home Office to provide guidance on how non-traditional stakeholders like financial services can engage with DHRs. And we're calling for greater consistency in DHRs in recording demographic information, and for the Home Office to update the recording form that CSPs have to include when submitting a DHR for quality assurance, so that this form includes economic abuse. So that's everything from me on the research findings. So I'm going to hand back over to Sharon now.
Thank you, Catherine. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge that a lot of what Catherine has shared is quite hard hitting, especially the lived experience of victims, of women who have actually died. So any of you who are involved in this work, I think it's fair to say that vicarious trauma is an occupational hazard. So please do look after yourselves today, especially after this session. So following on from Catherine's really important research findings and recommendations, I want to focus specifically now on the recommendation around the need for specialist training. So at C, we have developed good practice guidance on economic abuse and domestic homicide reviews, which we hope to deliver in the form of an interactive e-learning module, which will be ready to launch in a month's time. So the e-learning is really going to provide advice and practical examples to support integration of economic abuse into reviews. And the course is designed to be a really practical starting point for anyone involved in the review process, including authors, chairs, panel members, and community safety partnerships. So in the next section, I'm just going to give a quick high-level overview of the key areas of best practice that will be highlighted in the e-learning. And like I said earlier, further information on how to access the e-learning will be shared at the end of this session. And you'll also get a discount code for attending today. So we'll forward all that information onto you in the post-attendance resources. Can I have the next slide, please, Catherine? So on the screen, you will see the areas for good practice that we believe are critical. So thinking back to what Catherine said that over 50% of reviews included signs of economic abuse from an intimate partner, but a lot of the time that wasn't actually picked up by the panel members. So it's really important to look at naming and understanding economic abuse, analysing economic risk, harm, and lived experience of economic abuse, understanding how systems and services responded to economic abuse, applying an intersectional lens, especially relevant when we mentioned that we know that disabled women and Black and racially minoritized women are disproportionately impacted. And also strengthening multi-agency responses and learning on economic abuse. So the e-learning is going to walk us through the key steps that you can see on the screen here. So the first part, if you go to the next slide, please, Catherine. The first part is going to focus on the appointment of the chair and the author and explains really how the makeup of the panel is absolutely key to whether economic abuse is recognised and considered. And the second part then will focus on how we integrate economic abuse into the scope in terms of reference of a domestic homicide review, making the case for why it's important to name and understand economic abuse, kind of setting the foundation of whether economic abuse is meaningfully explored or missed. And it will also include practical advice with examples on potential lines of inquiry that you could follow. The third part then, if it focuses on collection of evidence and research for the review. So really to help the panel better understand the breadth of agencies that actually may have evidence on economic abuse, and sometimes they might not be the traditional agencies that we think should be involved or are usually involved. So we'll include tips for for using individual management reviews, interviews with friends and family, and also secondary research to understand the role that economic abuse plays in victims' deaths. Then another key section that we'll look at is the guidance on compilation of the review. So here we hope to take learners through a series of steps to help identify how economic abuse may feature over time in a combined chronology. And it will also look to give advice on the analysis stage, supporting an understanding of how economic abuse may have acted as an aggravating factor. It will also help reviewers think about things like agencies and systems and how sometimes they may be inadvertently facilitated the economic abuse. And it will also outline best practice in how conclusions, learning and recommendations should be set out with a direct reference to naming economic abuse. And then to finish off, it will look at the guidance, making sure that economic abuse is translated into really practical and achievable actions in how you include it in the review. So looking then about how you actually access the e-learning. Again, we will be sharing this information afterwards, so don't worry too much about collecting this information now, but Catherine is going to put a link to the training inquiry form in the chat. If you go on to the next slide, Catherine. So you'll be able to access the training from this link. It's due to launch in 1 month's time. And for everyone that's attended today, we're going to give an introductory offer of £35 per person with the discount code on the screen. We really want to make sure that this course is accessible to absolutely everyone. And we also note that a lot of people who are working on reviews are doing so independently. So we want to make sure that the price that we're offering makes that accessible. So we'll finish up before we go to the Q&A with a quote that you'll see on the screen. This quote is from our Surviving Economic Abuse CEO, Sam Smethers. And she said that if we are to prevent further deaths, economic abuse must be recognised, understood and acted upon across every agency, every review and every response. Together we can save lives and stop economic abuse forever. And that's absolutely true. We can't do this work alone. This is why sessions like today are so important, and this is really all about collaborative working for all of us. So we're going to move now to the Q&A. I think Catherine has been taking a look at some questions that may be in the Q&A section already, and we'd ask that people use the Q&A section only to ask the questions. That way we can keep record of them, and anything that we don't get to in this time we can respond to later. And also, just because of the sheer number of people that are in this webinar, it's a little bit difficult to manage it through the raising hand function and conversation. So if we could use the Q&A, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Sharon. So we've got some questions coming in already. So we've got a question from Rachel around death by suicide. So when economic abuse was evident, how often was the perpetrator convicted of crimes relating to financial abuse? Thinking particularly when they've not been convicted of a crime relating to the death. So anecdotally, I would say that was quite rare, that a perpetrator was convicted of an alternative crime or something else. We also know from our research on control and inclusive behaviour prosecutions, published by Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, and her work on coercive control and behaviour prosecutions, that quite often, unfortunately, those kind of prosecutions alongside coercive control weren't happening. So unfortunately, I think it's probably, from what we saw in the DHRs, it's probably quite unlikely that perpetrators are being convicted of another crime. Thank you for that question. So
yeah, shall we do this one by one, Catherine, if that suits you? I just noticed that there's a few questions in the chat around the gendered narrative of abuse, and I think it's really important to address that. We're not saying that economic abuse doesn't happen to everyone. What we're saying is that our work at SEE focuses on economic abuse as a form of the wider context of violence against women and girls, and I think we'd be doing everyone a disservice if we didn't use a gendered kind of lens on that, because we know that depending on your role in society and kind of gender roles that we are automatically assigned from birth, there are certain expectations and roles that are assigned to us, and perpetrators will absolutely use those to exploit us. So that is different depending on your gender. So hence why we look at it through that gendered lens. But as I mentioned in the chat earlier, any of the guidance that we are giving in the e-learning could be applied to absolutely anyone.
And just to add to that as well, we know that the recommendations we make, whilst our evidence is often based on the experiences of women for all the reasons that Sharon's just outlined, we believe that the recommendations we make will benefit all victims of economic abuse. And I can see, Lorena, you've asked a question on if we have data or research insights on the links between economic abuse and drug and alcohol use, particularly in safeguarding context. So we haven't included them within this presentation or within the report, but we do have some findings in a forthcoming book chapter, which look at how many victims and perpetrators of economic abuse had experiences of substance misuse. So those findings are forthcoming. I think we know that it's a very difficult area, and that, you know, perpetrators will exploit or create existing dependencies as a form and alongside the economic abuse, and in that context of coercive control. So thank you for that question. Sharon, I don't know if there's a couple of questions on the training, on the e-learning.
I know there was a question someone had asked in the chat around prosecutions relating to economic abuse. Unfortunately, they are still kind of few and far between, but we do have some specific research in both our reports called Seen Yet Sidelined and In Plain Sight, which specifically focus on prosecutions around coercive and controlling behaviour, and out of those, how many of those included details of economic abuse. So we can absolutely share those for your reference in the post-attendance resources as well. I'll just make a note to pop those in for you.
Thanks, Sharon. I can see as well that we've got a question of was there any evidence of abuse via the legal aid systems, and something that this person's come across in their work many times. We've certainly heard a lot about the abuse of legal aid, or victims not being able to access legal aid. Yeah, I can't recall that there was explicit mentions of legal aid in particular, but in perpetrators abusing this, but we certainly saw that there were many examples where the victim couldn't afford legal aid, legal representation. There was certainly a case where one victim was having to represent herself in ongoing family court proceedings. So we know that this is a really significant issue, and we've been working in the field of working to make changes in the field of legal aid for a while, because yeah, we've also heard that this is a really prevalent issue for victims of economic abuse.
Absolutely. And to follow on from what Catherine has said around legal aid, I think that's part of the evidence there that she's just mentioned is that legal aid as a form of economic abuse isn't usually picked up in reviews because there may be limited understanding about how victims actually experience abuse that's related to legal aid. And one example that we see of that quite often is through someone who is abusing assets. So say, for example, if you have a joint mortgage with a perpetrator or abuser and you have to flee your home because it's no longer safe for you to be there, and you then have moved somewhere else, or maybe you have a joint account with a perpetrator and there's money in that account, but you don't have any access to it because they're not letting you access it. When you go to apply for legal aid, it may look like you actually have assets when you don't, and that means that you're not eligible to actually get it. But on the other side as well, we see perpetrators using it as a weapon, where often they will leave their job or go part-time so that they are actually eligible for legal aid, and then take the victim who may be working through the court process purposely to run up masses of legal debt for that person, where we see them weaponizing things like the court process then, where they may not provide their full financial statements, and they might not turn up for court dates, really just sabotaging that process with a motivation, I suppose, behind it to cause financial ruin for the victim.
Yeah, and another thing, and this came up unfortunately in the DHRs, was perpetrators not disclosing their financial assets during proceedings in order to try and sabotage the victim, often their children as well, post-separation, and as they were trying to rebuild following the economic abuse. And Sharon, there's a question from Bryony around the e-learning and whether these are pre-arranged sessions that we book onto, or whether you can sort of book for several panel members for each CSP.
Yes, so the e-learning is designed to be single sign up. So each person will just sign up individually and access it at their leisure.
Thanks, Sharon. I hope that's helpful, Bryony. Let me just have a look, see if any other questions that we've got in a minute. I see there's a question from Casey around whether the names of the women mentioned in their cases can be shared. So in our full report, which we'll share the link to as part of the post-webinar resources, we've got even further information and summaries of their cases as well within the report. So thank you for that question, because yeah, we really wanted to share some of the experiences and examples of women and the victims affected by economic abuse within the session, because we know that it's hard, it's really difficult to hear. But I think it can be really powerful to hear about their experiences and what happened to them. Thank you. Sharon, are there any other questions that you wanted to answer?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I'm just having a scan through. I can't see any there that we haven't answered. Let me just have a little look through.
I've just spotted one more from Amelia. Have you found any links, or is there any research you know of which looks at economic abuse, dowry abuse and DHRs? I think this is a really emerging area. We conducted a global literature review of economic abuse. We published that in 2022, so that's called Economic Abuse, a Global Perspective. And in that, we looked at sort of all the evidence that we know about economic abuse, including the different sort of behaviours around it. And we've got a summary of economic abuse and what's known about dowry abuse in there. There's research from, there is some research, but I think it's definitely an area that we need to know more about, and more about how perpetrators are able to misuse that. Thank you for that question, because it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to follow on from that question, dowry-related abuse is something that comes up as a common theme. We did some work on a project called Compass, which was a pilot project we ran in Brighton and Hove from some frontline service delivery partners there, and we looked at a model to build a kind of collaborative approach across agencies to economic abuse. And within that, dowry abuse was a recurring theme. And I think to kind of widen it out from the context of intimate partner violence, when dowry abuse is present through that project, a lot of our frontline service delivery partners informed us through the lived experience of victims of dowry abuse that often it's within a much wider familial context as well. So again, going back to what I said at the start of the slides, looking at our work mainly focuses on economic abuse within the context of intimate partner abuse, but it's really important that we do kind of keep that wider lens open on the other dynamics like familial abuse, and child-to-parent abuse is another huge one, especially when we look at statistics on older person abuse. Quite often that's actually carried out by children to their elderly parents. When I say children, I mean their adult children.
Thank you, Sharon. I think we've answered all the questions in the Q&A at the minute. If anyone does have any sort of last minute questions that they want to pop in the chat, please, in the Q&A function, please do. Just got a couple of minutes left for any further questions in the Q&A.
So thank you, everyone. Anything that we didn't get to, we will have a look through both the chat and the Q&A after the session, and follow up with the resources that we mentioned, and any kind of messages or questions you had that slipped through the net, we will address them in the post-course resources. So Catherine has just shared on the screen there some ways to keep in touch with us at sea. You have our website there, survivingeconomicabuse.org. And just to reference the link that we shared at the start of the chat, if anyone is currently experiencing economic abuse, but also maybe supporting someone who is, there are numerous resources on our website, specifically under the I Need Help tab. And under our training section, you'll find information about all of our training that we offer. The e-learning for domestic homicide reviews isn't uploaded there yet, but we'll be sending around the information on that quite shortly. But anything we can do to help, please do pop us an email. You'll see our training address there and some of the tags for our social media channels. So really just want to end by saying thank you so much for engaging today. Again, I know it's a really difficult topic, but really important. And just the sheer amount of people that showed up for the webinar gives me great hope in terms of collaborative working on addressing economic abuse. So at Sea, we're really, really passionate about changing hearts and minds, and we hope that this session has encouraged you to look at how you can better integrate economic abuse into practice, whatever sector you may be in. So yes, thank you again, and please do keep in touch.